You have been told to be the bigger person when dealing with difficult people. Lao Tzu called that strategy something else entirely, and he wrote it down during the most violent period in Chinese history. The Tao Te Ching isn't a book about meditation. It's a tactical manual on how to be untouchable, and the method it describes has nothing to do with being nice and everything to do with being unmoved. The empty boat. Why reaction is the real enemy. The year is roughly 300 BCE. A man is crossing a river in a small boat when another vessel drifts toward him on a collision course. The boats strike with a sound like wood splitting on stone. The man doesn't become angry. He looks again and sees the other boat is empty, with no one steering it, simply drifting on the current. He steers around it and continues on his way. Sound familiar? You've had this exact experience. Something goes wrong. A deadline is missed, a message ignored, or a colleague takes credit for your work while you're sitting right there. Your first impulse isn't anger, only confusion. As you try to understand what just happened, then you realize someone chose to do this. That's when the anger arrives. You feel the heat in your chest and the tightening in your jaw, and you begin rehearsing an argument in your head that hasn't even started. Sensation hits before thought. Your body readies itself for combat before your mind has even identified the threat. Zhuangzi, the philosopher who recorded this story in chapter 20 of his book, noticed something precise about what happened in that boat. The collision didn't change. The boats didn't hit any harder. The water didn't become more violent. What changed was the man's assumption about the other boat. He shifted from seeing an empty vessel drifting on a current to seeing a person who chose to hit him. And here is what most people miss about this moment. The anger doesn't come from the harm. It comes from the story you tell yourself about the harm. The story claims someone chose this, that they aimed it at you, that they possessed free will and used it against you. Before you were dealing with physics as a boat drifted, after you were dealing with malice, a person attacked, the damage was identical. Your response wasn't. Modern psychology has caught up to what Zhuangzi saw 2 millennia ago. Stephen Stosny, a researcher who studies anger and emotional reactivity, describes what he calls dynamic emotional reactivity. One person's negative emotion causes a negative emotion in the other, and the interaction makes both behave in ways they wouldn't behave alone. Stosny mapped the specific pattern: reacting to jerks like a jerk, responding rudely to perceived rudeness, accusing when you feel accused, manipulating when you feel manipulated. Stosny observed that in these moments, most thought processes go toward justifying the feeling rather than testing the reality of its perceptual influence. The brain shifts from a thought-based understanding of reality into a feeling-based hallucination of character. This is why you find yourself recalling past disputes with revised dialogue. When they said that, I should have said this. You imagine disagreements that haven't even taken place. You feel that other people bring you down, make you angry, get on your nerves. Stosny calls this pattern the reactaholic. Not sure of your own opinions or convictions until you react to someone. You're not certain who you are until someone provokes you, and then you discover yourself in the explosion. And this isn't strength, this is dependency wearing a mask of intensity. The difficult person didn't create your anger. They triggered a pattern that was already yours. You were waiting for a reason. You were holding a loaded weapon and looking for a target. But the weapon was never in their hand. It was in yours, or the trigger was inside you before they ever pulled it. Here is where this lands for you. Difficult people don't have power because they're strong. They have power because they can make you react. Your reaction is their lever. Without it, they have nothing to push against. The empty boat never made anyone angry. The moment you see a person in the boat, the game begins. And most of us spend our entire working lives playing it without knowing the rules. We think we're defending ourselves. We're actually arming our opponents. The manual, what Lao Tzu taught about conflict, So if reaction is the trap, what is the alternative? Lao Tzu wrote the manual 2,500 years ago, and he didn't write it for monks. Lao Tzu compiled the Tao Te Ching during the Eastern Zhou period, an era of constant warfare, political betrayal, and assassination. Kingdoms rose and fell in single seasons. Alliances were made and broken between breakfast and dinner. Rulers were poisoned by their own sons. Generals switched sides between sunset and dawn. This was a survival manual written for people surrounded by genuine enemies who held genuine power over their lives. It wasn't meditation guidance for comfortable people living in stable times. It was real strategy for rulers who needed to stay alive until next spring. Wu Wei is the term Lao Tzu uses for this strategy. Most people translate it as non-action, and that's exactly wrong. Wu Wei isn't the absence of action, it's the absence of forcing. Action remains real, movement remains real, work remains real, but there's no longer a self standing behind the movement, watching it, judging it, trying to control its outcome. The cook hasn't stopped working. He's working more precisely than anyone watching him can comprehend. He isn't doing less. He has eliminated the wasted effort of pushing where things don't want to go. Let me be concrete. Water doesn't argue with stone, it shapes it. Chapter 78 of the Tao Te Ching puts it this way: nothing in the world is softer and weaker than water, yet to attack the hard and strong nothing surpasses it. The weak overcomes the strong, the soft overcomes the hard. Everybody in the world knows this, still nobody makes use of it. The Roman poet Ovid made the same observation centuries later. Dripping water hollows out the stone, not through force, but through persistence. Water embraces instead of confronts. It caresses instead of beats, but it still subdues eventually. A difficult co-worker is the stone. Your reactivity is you trying to beat the stone with a hammer. Your stillness is you being the water that shapes the stone without ever asking permission. Water doesn't need agreement. It doesn't need to be noticed. It simply continues being water, and the stone is changed by the contact whether it likes it or not. And here is where most people miss the point. Chapter 69 adds the tactical layer. The generals have a saying: rather than make the first move, it's better to wait and see. Rather than advance an inch, it's better to retreat a yard. This is called marching without moving, pushing back without using weapons. To advance as the guest rather than the host means not claiming the territory of conflict. Let the other person advance into a space you've already decided not to defend. In modern terms, this means not taking the bait. Don't claim the email thread. Don't claim the argument in the break room. Let them have the territory they're fighting for, because that territory isn't where you live. There's no greater misfortune than underestimating your enemy. Underestimating your enemy means thinking that he's evil. In doing so, you destroy your 3 treasures and become an enemy yourself. The 3 treasures are compassion, frugality, and humility. Compassion means you can see the other person clearly without needing them to be a monster. Frugality means you don't spend your energy where it returns nothing. Humility means you don't need to win the argument to know you're right. When you think your enemy is evil, you lose all 3. You become cruel, wasteful, and arrogant. You become the very thing you oppose. When 2 great forces oppose each other, the victory will go to the one that knows how to yield. The army that laments war wins. The side that enters the fight with sorrow does so because it has nothing to prove. That's the side that can't be baited. That's the side that has already won before the first weapon is drawn. Chapter 68 closes the loop. The best fighter is never angry. This is mushin, what the Japanese call mind of no mind, the state in which skill operates without self-consciousness supervising it. A swordsman who can't be rattled cannot be defeated. Yagyu Munenori, the deadliest swordsman in Japan, trained thousands of warriors. His foundation came from a Chinese text written 1,500 years earlier. That text said force was a symptom of confusion. Its greatest warrior had learned to do nothing, and in doing nothing couldn't be stopped. Stillness isn't withdrawal, it's a tactical position. You're not running away from the conflict, you're choosing the terrain where you can't be moved. That isn't passivity, that's a different kind of power. The mountain doesn't avoid the wind, it simply can't be moved by it. And the wind, after enough time against the mountain, changes direction. It has to. The mountain doesn't celebrate this victory. The mountain doesn't even notice. 4 responses, the Taoist playbook. Here is where this lands for you. 4 specific responses drawn from the text that you can use in the conversation you're dreading on Thursday. The first response is this: don't react immediately. The pause is your greatest strength. Chapter 69 says it directly. Rather than make the first move, better to wait and see. What this looks like in a real conversation is the 3-second delay that breaks the circuit. Someone sends an email that assumes the worst about your intentions. A coworker interrupts you in a meeting to make a point at your expense. A relative provokes you at dinner because they know which buttons to press. Your body wants to respond before your mind has even finished processing what was said. The other person's urgency is artificial. Their timeline isn't your timeline. They want you to respond before you have thought, because that's the only way their tactic works. They need speed, so you can't be accurate. They need volume, so you can't be clear. Stosny's research confirms this exactly. Reactivity spreads exponentially, and the only way out is to interrupt the circuit at its source. You don't need to meditate. You don't need to breathe deeply. You need to wait 3 seconds. That's the practice. In those 3 seconds, the other person is left performing anger into a silence that doesn't react. It exhausts them, and it gives you the one thing you actually need, which is clarity. Here is what it looks like in practice. Your manager interrupts you in a meeting to correct something you said. The room goes quiet. Everyone is watching to see if you'll defend yourself, explain yourself, or escalate. Wait 3 seconds. Look at them. Don't look away. Don't look down. Just wait. During that pause, the power shifts. They have thrown a punch at something that doesn't flinch, and now everyone in the room sees it. The second response is harder than the first because it asks you to do nothing in a situation where doing something feels like self-defense. Stop explaining yourself. Not every misunderstanding deserves correction. The Tao Te Ching says it this way: if you affirm yourself, you won't shine. Here is what most people miss about this moment. When you explain yourself to someone who isn't listening, you're performing competence for an audience of one who has already left the theatre. They're not waiting to be convinced. They're waiting for you to invest enough energy that your frustration becomes their victory. Explanation becomes a trap. The more you justify yourself, the more invested you become in their validation. You go from having a position to needing them to acknowledge it. That isn't the same thing. You should explain yourself when the relationship has stakes and the other person is actually listening. You shouldn't explain yourself when you're being baited. The difference between those two situations is everything. A colleague asking a genuine question deserves an answer. One asking a question designed to make you defend your existence deserves silence. Silence isn't rude. Silence is the recognition that the game being offered isn't one you're playing. Here is the test. If you're typing a response to an email and you find yourself using words like actually or to be clear, stop. Delete the email. Wait an hour. If you still need to send it then. Most of the time, you won't. The third response is the most difficult. Refuse emotional games. The best fighter is never angry. The difficult person needs you to play their game. Your refusal is the end of the game. You don't have to win every battle. Sometimes walking away is wisdom. Chapter 69 repeats the warning. When two great forces oppose each other, the victory will go to the one that knows how to yield. This is counterintuitive, because we're trained to think that yielding is losing. Water yields to stone, then shapes it over time. Anyone who needs you to be angry needs you to be controllable. When you refuse to pick up the weapon they have handed you, they're left holding it alone. That's the practice. The argument can't continue without two participants. One person can't argue alone. They can shout into a void, but that exhausts them. Eventually they stop, not because they have seen the error of their ways, because the game is no longer fun when the other player won't move. Think about the last family dinner where someone brought up politics, or your career, or your relationship status, knowing exactly which nerve to press. They weren't looking for understanding. They were looking for a reaction. When you don't give them one, the energy they brought into the room has nowhere to land. It hits the floor. The fourth response is the foundation. Protect your inner peace. Other people's chaos doesn't have to become yours. This isn't a metaphor. It's a boundary. The empty boat applied means seeing the other person's behavior as physics, cause and effect, conditions they didn't choose. A difficult person isn't a villain targeting you personally. They're a boat drifting on currents they didn't create, propelled by causes they didn't choose. That doesn't mean you allow the collision. It means you stop imagining a captain who chose to hit you. Mushin in the office means doing your work with precision while the chaos operates around you, untouched. The cook doesn't stop working when someone shouts in the kitchen. He continues cutting because his attention is in the blade, not in the noise. The mountain doesn't argue with the wind. It simply can't be moved. This isn't dissociation. This isn't pretending the chaos doesn't exist. It's the recognition that your peace is your responsibility, not a gift that difficult people hand you when they decide to behave. You don't need them to change. You need your own center to be heavy enough that their chaos can't shift it. The boundary isn't a wall you build against them. It's a weight you add to yourself. What changes the physics of peace? But here is the real question. What actually changes when you start operating this way? Because if the payoff is just that, you feel better, that isn't enough. The payoff has to be real. When you stop reacting, manipulation loses its grip. Manipulation requires a lever, and your reaction is the lever. A gaslighting colleague can only gaslight someone who doubts themselves enough to argue back. A narcissistic manager can only dominate someone who needs their approval enough to explain themselves. Remove the reaction, and the manipulation has no surface to grip. It slips off. The person pushing finds themselves pushing against air. They can't get traction. Arguments lose momentum because they require two participants. One person can't argue alone, and performing anger into silence exhausts them quickly. Your confidence grows because you're no longer controlled by external provocation. Your emotional state is no longer someone else's remote control. They press the button and nothing happens. The channel doesn't change. The volume doesn't rise. After a while, they stop pressing the button. Not because they've changed, but because the remote no longer works. They'll find a new remote. That's their business. Your business is being the television that can't be turned on by someone else's anger. Your peace becomes difficult to disturb, not because you have become saintly, but because you have become heavy. Like a mountain, the confirmation bias cycle breaks. When you stop justifying your anger, your perception of the other person changes. They become smaller, not because they have changed, because your reactivity was magnifying them. Without your reaction, they're simply a person making noise. The wind can't disturb the mountain. The wind can only blow. Your goal isn't to silence difficult people. It's to become someone they can no longer pull away from your center. The one practice to test is this. In your next difficult encounter, wait 3 seconds before responding. That's all you need. Just 3 seconds. Count them slowly. 1, then 2, then 3. In that space, You'll feel the urge to react, the pull to defend, to explain, to win. Let it pass, then respond from stillness instead of reflex. See what changes. Mastering Taoism isn't required. Reading the entire text isn't required. 3 seconds is all you need. That's the practice. Tell me where in your life you're currently forcing something that the situation isn't asking for. I read everyone and subscribe. We go this deep every week. Thanks for watching.